The morning I walked out of Beaver Creek Institution, it was minus 17 degrees, and the sky above Gravenhurst was the color of old dishwater. I stood at the front gate with a plastic bag holding everything I'd brought in 20 months ago. A wool sweater, a pair of reading glasses, and my late wife's photograph. The CO handed me back my wallet. There was $43 in it. I counted it twice because I couldn't think of anything else to do. My son-in-law's lawyer had taken care of the rest. I didn't cry. I'd done all my crying somewhere around month 4, alone in a bottom bunk, while a man named Earl in the bed above me snored through a thunderstorm. I'd used up whatever I had left somewhere around month 11. When I received a birthday card from my granddaughter, 7 years old, written in purple crayon, and realized my daughter had let her send it. That was the cruelest thing she ever did, and I'm not sure. Let me go back to the beginning. Because you need to understand what I had before any of this happened. To understand what it meant to lose it, I spent 31 years building Harrowfield Property Management. Started it out of the basement of our house in Barrie when my wife was still alive, and my daughter was 4 years old, riding her tricycle in circles around my desk while I made cold calls. I managed rental properties, residential mostly, a few small commercial units, and I was good at it. Not flashy. Not the kind of man who drove a leased BMW and talked about his portfolio at dinner parties. I kept honest books, treated my tenants decently, and reinvested almost everything back into the company. By the time I was 61, Harrowfield managed 47 properties across Simcoe County. I had 3 full-time staff, a bookkeeper named Phyllis who'd been with me for 16 years, and a reputation that meant something in this part of Ontario. When my wife passed, cancer, 7 years ago last February, I thought about selling, but the company was the only thing that kept my hands busy enough that my mind didn't swallow me whole. So I kept going. My daughter had always been sharp. She got her mother's instincts and my stubbornness, which is either a gift or a curse depending on the week. After she finished her business degree at Lakehead, she came to work with me. I was proud of her. I'm still proud of her, even now, which is something I've never been able to explain properly. Not even to myself. She met her husband at a real estate conference in Toronto. He was a financial consultant. That's what his cards said. He had the kind of confidence that fills a room before he does, and he spoke about investment structures and tax optimization with the easy authority of someone who assumes everyone in the conversation already trusts him. I didn't trust him. Not immediately, but my daughter loved him, and I loved my daughter. And I told myself that my unease was just a father's instinct to hold on too long. We had a small wedding at a lodge up near Huntsville. I paid for it. I danced badly to a song my wife used to hum while she cooked, and when my daughter laughed at my 2 left feet, I thought, this is enough. Whatever else happens, this is enough. They moved to Collingwood. He set up a consulting practice, and she continued managing the Harrowfield accounts remotely, which I thought made sense. She knew the business. She'd been doing it for 6 years. I trusted her completely. That's the word that keeps coming back. Trusted. About 2 years into their marriage, my son-in-law started suggesting I think about modernizing the company's financial structure. He mentioned something called a holding company arrangement, splitting Harrowfield into an operating company and a property holding company for tax efficiency. It was a real thing. I knew it was a real thing because other property managers in the county had done versions of it. He offered to handle the restructuring as a favor. Family, he said. No fee. I should have paid for an independent lawyer. Instead, I signed what he put in front of me over 4 separate meetings at their kitchen table in Collingwood, while my granddaughter colored at the other end of the table, and my daughter served coffee. The documents were long and technical. I read them. I thought I understood them. I asked questions and he answered them in the kind of thorough, patient way that makes you feel foolish for having asked. What I signed, and what I didn't understand until much later, was a restructuring that shifted the ownership of the holding company into a numbered corporation he controlled. Not jointly, not partially, he controlled it. The 47 properties I had spent 31 years acquiring were now sitting inside a company I didn't actually own, and my daughter had countersigned as a witness. I found out in the worst possible way. Phyllis called me on a Tuesday morning in March. She was crying before I even said hello, which had never happened in 16 years, not even when her husband had his bypass surgery. She told me that the CRA had contacted her with questions about Harrowfield's accounts. There were transactions she didn't recognize, transfers to a numbered company she'd never been given documentation for. A line of credit opened against 3 of the rental properties she hadn't known were mortgaged. I drove to the office and we went through everything together. The transfers went back 14 months. Over $800,000, moved in increments small enough to not trigger automatic review, into an account we couldn't trace through anything I had access to. I called my daughter. She didn't answer. I called her husband. He didn't answer either. By the end of that week, the CRA had frozen Harrowfield's operating account pending investigation. My son-in-law's lawyer had filed a complaint with the Ontario Provincial Police, alleging that I had fraudulently transferred company assets to conceal them from creditors. Creditors I'd never had. The story they told was that I had set up the holding structure myself, moved the money offshore to avoid my own taxes, and then tried to blame my son-in-law when the scheme was discovered. My daughter told this story to the police. In writing, under oath, I want to be precise about that. She didn't just fail to defend me, she actively accused me. The arrest happened at 6:15 in the morning. 2 OPP officers and a financial crimes investigator. They were professional and quiet about it, which I appreciated, because my neighbor Doris is 78 and tends to watch from her kitchen window every morning while her kettle boils, and I didn't want her to see me taken out of my own front door in handcuffs. She saw anyway. She was at Phyllis's house with a casserole by noon. The bail hearing was the first time I sat in a room with my daughter and her husband since March. She sat on the opposite side of a courtroom in Barrie and did not look at me once, not once in 4 hours. Her husband sat beside her with his hands folded on the table and the calm, patient expression of a man who believes he's already won. Bail was granted, but I was required to surrender my passport and report weekly to the OPP detachment in Barrie. The conditions felt designed to remind me, every week, that I was considered a flight risk by the province of Ontario. I had never in my life had reason to flee anywhere. I couldn't afford the legal representation I needed. The firm I initially retained quoted me $180,000 for a trial of this complexity. I paid a $60,000 retainer from money I'd kept in a personal savings account, money my son-in-law's restructuring hadn't touched, possibly because he forgot about it, or possibly because taking everything would have looked too deliberate too quickly. When the retainer ran out, the firm withdrew. I ended up with a legal aid lawyer named Tim. He was younger than my granddaughter's eventual age for starting university, and he worked out of an office in Barrie that smelled like the of a filing cabinet. But he was sharp, and he believed me, and those 2 things mattered more than his office decor. The trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution had documentation. The restructuring documents I'd signed, the transfer records, an affidavit from my daughter detailing what she characterized as my instructions regarding the numbered company setup. What they didn't have was a digital forensics expert, because we couldn't afford one. That was the gap we never closed. The emails my son-in-law had sent me, walking me through the restructuring, explaining each component in his own words, casually noting at one point that he'd handle the corporate registration. Those emails existed. They were on my laptop and in my Gmail account. Tim submitted them as evidence. But without an expert to authenticate them to the court's satisfaction, the prosecution was able to raise enough doubt about their context. The judge found me guilty of 1 count of fraud over $5,000. She sentenced me to 3 years. Tim put a hand on my shoulder afterward and said he was sorry. I thanked him for trying. I meant it. I didn't speak at sentencing. There was nothing I could think of to say that wouldn't either break down in the middle of saying it, or come out sounding like a man who still couldn't accept what was happening to him. Both of those things were true. I called my granddaughter from the holding cell before they transferred me. She was 6. She didn't fully understand where I was going. I told her I had to go away for a while for work, which was the least honest thing I've ever said to a child, and it will stay with me. I served my time at Beaver Creek, which is a minimum security facility about 2 hours north of Barrie. The grounds are kept up. There's a vegetable garden. I'm not listing these things sarcastically. They genuinely helped. The man in the bunk above mine for the first 8 months was a retired pipefitter from Sudbury named Stan. He'd been convicted of tax evasion. Genuinely had done it, he told me, without any particular shame, because he'd decided the government had already taken enough of his money over 40 years and he'd simply stopped participating. He was 64 years old and had the resigned cheerfulness of a man who had made his peace with most things. Stan taught me how the facility worked, who to avoid, which guards were fair-minded, and which ones were looking for reasons to make your day worse. He taught me how to play cribbage because the evenings were very long. And there was a battered cribbage board in the common room that nobody else seemed to want. He helped me in ways that cost him nothing but time, and I am grateful for it in ways I've never properly articulated to anyone. When Stan was released, 6 months before I was, he wrote his phone number on a piece of paper torn from a paperback novel and told me to call him when I got out. I still have that piece of paper. The first thing I did when I got out, after standing at the gate in the cold and counting my $43, was call Stan from a payphone at the Tim Hortons in Gravenhurst. He answered on the second ring. He drove from Sudbury to Gravenhurst in just over 2 hours and brought me a coffee and a ham sandwich and didn't make me talk until I was ready, which took about 40 minutes of driving south on Highway 11. That kind of thing is worth more than I can explain. What had been happening while I was inside, I pieced together from Tim, from Phyllis, and eventually from the documents themselves. Phyllis had never stopped working on it. This was not her job anymore. Harrowfield had been effectively dismantled, the properties either sold or transferred, the office closed. But Phyllis had spent 16 years keeping Harrowfield's records, and she had a personal investment in the truth of those records that nothing could extinguish. She'd kept copies of everything. She had a filing cabinet in her spare bedroom in Barrie with 4 drawers full of documentation, going back 11 years. More importantly, she had made a complaint to the Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario about my son-in-law's consulting practice. That complaint had triggered a parallel investigation separate from the criminal proceedings against me. And that investigation, slow, unglamorous, conducted by people who read corporate documents for a living, had eventually found what Tim and I couldn't afford to prove at trial. The emails were authenticated. Not just mine, his. The entire chain of correspondence related to the restructuring, recovered from a server backup, his firm had been legally required to maintain. His instructions to the corporate lawyer who registered the numbered company. His note, and I've thought about this note many times, his note to my daughter explaining that the tax optimization structure they were implementing would give them operational control of the assets, and that it was important I not consult a separate lawyer because it would complicate the timeline. That note, to my daughter. She knew. I don't know, I will probably never know, whether she understood from the beginning what was being done, or whether she convinced herself it was something else and stopped asking questions. I don't know if she told herself it was financial planning until the point where she couldn't anymore. I don't know what she told herself on the day she gave a sworn statement to the police, accusing her father of fraud. What I know is that she knew. The FSRA findings were referred to the OPP. My son-in-law was arrested at their home in Collingwood in September, 14 months after I'd been released. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, breach of trust, and money laundering. His consulting license was suspended pending the outcome. My daughter was charged as an accessory. My conviction was referred to the Ontario Court of Appeal on the basis of new evidence. The appeal was allowed. The conviction was overturned. The presiding judge noted, in language that was precise and measured, and that I have read perhaps 40 times, that the original trial had proceeded on an incomplete evidentiary record, and that the authenticated correspondence demonstrated a clear pattern of deception directed at the appellant, meaning me, rather than perpetrated by him. The court issued a formal acknowledgement of the wrongful conviction. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. I sat in Tim's new office. He'd moved to a better one. He had a real practice now, and I read that acknowledgement 3 times. I thought about what my son-in-law's lawyer had argued at trial, that I was a man trying to escape accountability, that I had spent 30 years building a business and then decided to steal from it. I thought about the 6:15 knock on my door. I thought about Doris at her kitchen window with her kettle. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. The movies tell you there's a moment when justice lands and something releases in your chest. What I felt was tired. Deeply, structurally tired, in a way that $43 and a ham sandwich from Stan hadn't touched. What I did feel, what I still feel, was clear. My daughter called me the week after the appeal decision. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 3 days later. I listened to both messages. In the first one, she was crying. In the second one, she was calmer. Her voice flat in the way voices go flat when someone has rehearsed what they're going to say so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't understood. That word, understood. What he had been planning until it was already in motion, and that by then she'd been afraid. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after the second message. I have a granddaughter who is 9 years old now, and draws horses in the margins of everything she writes, and apparently has decided she wants to be a marine biologist, which seems to me like a magnificent ambition for someone who lives 3 hours from the nearest ocean. She spent most of my incarceration being told things by her parents that I don't know and can't ask her about, and whatever she was told, she still sent me birthday cards in purple crayon. That child is not responsible for what her parents did. I called my daughter back. I want to be precise about this too, because I think people misunderstand what forgiveness is. I did not call her back because I had forgiven her. I called her back because my granddaughter deserves to have a grandfather in her life who isn't a silence on the other end of the phone. And because I am 63 years old, and I have already spent 20 months of whatever time I have left in a minimum security facility north of Gravenhurst, and I am not willing to spend whatever comes next in a different kind of prison. We spoke for 40 minutes. I didn't ask her to explain, and she didn't offer to. I asked about my granddaughter. My daughter told me she was doing well in school, that she'd made the swim team, that she'd recently lost her second-to-last baby tooth and was very proud of this. I said I'd like to see her. My daughter said yes. My son-in-law's trial is scheduled for next spring. Phyllis has been formally recognized as a key witness for the prosecution. She called me to tell me, and her voice sounded the way it does when she's trying not to seem as satisfied as she is, which is a particular Phyllis sound I'd missed more than I knew. I am living in a rented apartment in Barrie. It's smaller than my old house, but the building has a good furnace, and the woman in the unit below me has a basset hound, named something I can't pronounce, who sits in the lobby on Sunday mornings like he's waiting for someone to make an announcement. Harrowfield is gone. The properties were liquidated during the proceedings, and I have a civil suit in progress to recover what I can. But I've been honest with myself about what 31 years of work is worth. After a fraud conviction, even an overturned one, the number will be smaller than the thing it represents. I called Stan last Sunday. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes about nothing important. Hockey, the price of everything, a book he'd been reading about the construction of the St. Lawrence Seaway. He asked me how I was doing, and I told him I was doing all right, which was true enough to say without qualification. Before we hung up, I told him I was glad he'd been in the bunk above mine. He said, "Well, somebody had to be. There are mornings now, most mornings, actually, when I stand at the kitchen window of my apartment with coffee and watch the light come up over the rooftops and think about what I'm going to do with the time I have left, the civil suit, my granddaughter's swim meets, whether I want to get back into property management at a smaller scale, just enough to have something to build again. I don't have answers to most of it yet. But I walked out of Beaver Creek Institution on a morning that was minus 17 degrees with $43 and a photograph and the knowledge that every document that mattered had told the truth about me. That's what I had. It turned out to be enough to start with.